And with that dramatic intro, I welcome you on behalf of the MyData Conference for MyData Online 2020. The MyData Conference Online, what an amazing first for all of us. It's great to see you. We wish we could see you in person. However, here we are online. Thank you, COVID, for an amazing legacy for us to connect together still, worlds apart, but still unified in a common vision for the MyData principles and what the new world could look like. This plenary session kicks off the conference. I'm excited and privileged to be able to lead it and to moderate this session. My name's Jonathan Kempe. As you can see behind me, I'm here from Sydney, Australia. If you haven't visited, please do come. Happy to host, post-COVID, of course. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this session and to the conference. I'll be joined in just a moment by two esteemed colleagues who will talk us through what the new normal might look like, in particular with a focus on India. But for you, what I'd like you to do is to start putting your thinking cap on, consider what these topics are that we'll be covering off, how they might apply to you in your context, and how you might be able to adjust the things that you do around some of the principles that we'll discuss in the session today. But before we kick it off, I just want to make note of some things. It's now 1600 AEDT. Over your way, it might be about 5 o'clock in the morning, or depending, if you're over in the United States at a very different time. Please do relax, take a cup of tea or coffee, or a stiff drink, if that's more of your fancy, depending on the time of day. And we'll kick off into the session. First things first, we'll use Kiko Chat for questions. So we won't ask questions in Zoom. Say hello in Zoom, of course, but use Kiko Chat for Zoom. If you need to use the restrooms, my restrooms are just down the hall on the right-hand side. Yours might be in a different location. Just don't announce that you're doing that. And before we go into the formal plenary session, I'll pass it over to Timu to give us a brief intro. I just want to make a note about Timu, who's the general manager for MyData Global, if you haven't met him already. When I was chatting with him just the other day about how I should introduce him to us as a collective, he made an interesting comment. I think goes to the heart of what Timo and the core team's attitude is about MyData Global. He said, you don't need to focus, it's not really about me, we're co-creating this together. And I think that's a great attitude that really sets aside the principles that we all know and love about the MyData community and is embodied in Timo. So I'll pass it over to you, Timo. What's the conference about and what's important for this year?
Thanks for your kind words, Jono, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, everybody who's here, and welcome to the first MyData Online conference, the fifth MyData conference as a whole. Thanks indeed for blocking time off your busy schedule just as we're nearing the end of the year for this fantastic event. I'd just like to have, I hope you've had a chance to look at the great videos my colleagues Carolina and Sille put together and the greetings from the Digital Minister of Taiwan and the Minister of Transport and Communications of Finland to set a little bit of context. I'll not repeat everything, just maybe a couple of highlights. So first of all, like Jono said, thanks to COVID, we are now fully decentralized. It's an interesting event, definitely. We are here to talk about the human-centric approach to personal data. We are here to look for a vision that's a fair, sustainable, and prosperous digital society in which individuals have a right to say about how personal data is used, get value out of that data, and for organizations that ethical use of that data is the most attractive one. Thank you for joining. It's put together by MyData Global, a non-profit headquartered here in Helsinki, Finland, operating globally, as you can imagine from the name. Indeed, this year's been tough. No need to repeat that. I think regardless of where on this planet you are, it's been an awful year in many ways. And it's highlighted, of course, the need for personal data and rules on that personal data. So we use that for the benefit, not just of individuals and businesses, but of society as a whole, but putting rights first. Taking care of the infrastructures, the data governance, and so on. And even in this tough year, of course, there's a lot of positives. I mean, obviously, the whole digitalization leap, taking huge steps forward, and regulations, frameworks getting put in place all over the world. Just now in Europe, we talk about the Data Governance Act, for example, and just a couple of days, a ministerial declaration, the Berlin Declaration on digital society, on digital society and value-based digital government. But it's not about Europe. It's definitely about being worldwide, and that's why we are so excited. The upside of this all is that we have now 500 plus people from 50 plus countries in 40 sessions, over 200 presenters. We're able to do it in such a decentralized way. So this conference is not just a webinar or a set of webinars. It's a massive conference, a festival, an experiment, we might say. And we've gotten in the past a lot of feedback that it's a great conference from bringing together people from all over the world, from all kinds of different disciplines. And we want to value that, and we want you to value that as well. Please be active in the chats, like Jono said. Ask questions, encourage each others to speak up. And because we are coming from different perspectives, it will take some questions and answers and curiosity to find that common language. And when we do have big topics, big things we want to talk about, I just like to make note of the Saturday session, which is the open space, or sometimes called the Unconference Session, in which we will be able to, in some smaller groups, work and collaborate on particular topics. So it's a conference for learning, networking, forming alliances, and doing business. So on a personal level, I hope that we all can be mentally present and enjoy the sessions, be curious. So I encourage you and everyone to resist the urge to head off to work between the sessions and so on. Leave the browser on, stay with us. Check out the partner booths. We have 26 fantastic partners that have put their effort and resources to make this a fantastic event. Take the chance perhaps to meet the MyData Global staff and leadership. And hey, if you like the mission of what we are doing, we invite you to join us. But of course, make sure you also get a good stretch, a break of fresh air, and enjoy the serendipity. So we all make the conference together. Thank you for doing your part. So welcome on behalf of the organizing team once again. And finally, happy International Human Rights Day. I think that sets a good tone for the next 3 days to celebrate humans first. Back to you, Jonathan.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that introduction and for framing what we'll be looking at. It's really exciting to be a part of this event with everyone across multiple different time zones. And we look forward to sharing comments and questions with you as the conference progresses. So this session, as we can see, designing the new normal. And if this year has proven anything, normal is different to how it's always been. And we're going to be looking into the future of how digital societies around the world can take the things that MyData talks about and tries to put them into common data practices. How will that specifically work? And our focus in this session is the context of this session is around India and how India is paving a path towards the preferable new normal. What considerations will need to be kept in mind, and how can they build scalable systems that are both secure and data honoring in terms of the people that will use them? So in this session, Siddharth Shetty will open up about the India Stack and Data Empowerment and Protection Architecture, DEPA, which creates actionable insights or rights for every Indian to exercise control over their data. And as you can imagine, in such a society with the potential to have different layers in it, the need for this is very great. India Stack is a set of APIs that allows governments, businesses, startups and developers to utilize a unique digital infrastructure to solve India's hardest problems towards presenceless, paperless and cashless service delivery. DEPA deals with the consent layer of India Stack. Siddharth addresses the questions in this session around what are the biggest challenges and opportunities that they might be facing going forward in enabling a secure, portable and trusted data between these providers, and how to truly empower individuals with their data. Later in the session, we'll hear from Kaliya, who many of you know, Identity Woman, who'll then outline some of the considerations to be kept in mind when designing human-centric infrastructure and services. She'll explore different topics, including possible implications of some of the trade-offs we might face in terms of data practices and data handling, and what it might mean for individuals living in a digital society and the evolving digital societies that we find ourselves in around the world. A good question, which came out of earlier discussion, is are there multiple paths to the desired new normal, and how is it possible to build ecosystems around certain types of frameworks, which we'll explore in this session. So all of that being said, we do welcome Siddharth Shetty to begin your presentation. We look forward to hearing what you have to say about India Stack and the things that are progressing in Indian society.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, and thank you to the entire MyData team for inviting me and giving me a chance to present about the India Stack and the data empowerment and protection architecture. Hey everyone, I'm Siddharth, a volunteer with the iSpirit Foundation. It is a non-profit technology think tank based in Bangalore. And today I'll be talking to you about one, of course, the India Stack, which is this unique government infrastructure that's been built out, on top of which a range of private innovators are building applications for service delivery. But deep diving into what's been cooking over the last 4 to 5 years in India around how do we truly empower every individual and small business with control over their data. So the India Stack has been a decade-long journey, and it's a set of digital public infrastructure that started off first with the building out of Aadhaar, which is a unique biometric identity that's been delivered to over 1 billion Indians. Using that biometric identity, Indians are now able to access a range of government services across financial services, health services, various sorts of welfare benefits instantaneously in a presenceless manner. On top of Aadhaar, India subsequently created a foundation for electronic sharing of KYC information. And this allowed for, as you know, in various financial services where prevention of money laundering and counterterrorism efforts are a major concern. And there's often a lot of documentation involved, which actually raises the transaction costs, increases the barrier, and thus excludes a lot of people from participating in the formal system. eKYC allowed for secure portability of KYC records as a part of the Aadhaar system to any service provider, whether it was your bank, your telecom company, a mutual fund, a securities exchange, and so on. These were the two foundational components that enabled Indians into the digital system. The second step was we then needed to create infrastructure for engagement, and that resulted in the creation of new payment systems. As you know, we are still a developing economy, and we have fairly low per capita levels of income. And that resulted in the need to create new payment infrastructure that supported small value, high volume transactions, unlike the existing infrastructure of credit cards and others that really service higher value transactions. In that context, India created a mass market mobile payment system called UPI. Just last month, UPI crossed over 2 billion transactions. It's roughly about 3 to 4 years of its launch. Yesterday, what India did on UPI is greater than American Express's transactions worldwide. And soon we expect UPI over the next 30 months to overtake the transaction volume of Visa and MasterCard globally as well. What this allowed every Indian to do is they were now empowered with the ability to, at a click of a button, at low cost, move money from their bank account to any other bank account, whether that could be a friend, a merchant, or any other business for that matter. And so as this infrastructure rolled out, and you could think of it as much like GPS or much like the internet, which is public infra, on top of which private innovators have built applications. For example, GPS, US government-funded public good, on top of which private innovators like Google built out Google Maps, or the internet on top of open standards like HTTP, you had private innovators build out applications like the browser or email clients on top of SMTP. In India, we focused it more in the domain of financial and health inclusion. Now, as this infrastructure rolled out, and as connectivity, 4G connectivity, started permeating to hundreds of millions of Indians, and they started to adopt smartphones, it became critical to empower them with control over the data that was being generated. Because Indians were becoming data rich at an exponential pace, but the paradigm was very different. So unlike developed economies where, let's take the United States as an example, when the individuals became data rich, because they were already economically well off, data was fundamentally used to shape their spending patterns. So you would have high levels of discretionary income, and as a result, developers would create applications, use those applications to capture data, and then personalize the ads that they showed, and then earn a commission on those ads. And those are hugely powerful business models with, of course, a lot of risks that we've seen play out over the last few years. And so we felt in India, we have to invert this entire paradigm where data, instead of being used to sell things to the user as a predominant way of access, data should be used to empower them to access either better financial services by eliminating the asymmetry gaps in credit, bridging trust, access better health services, so moving away from physical-based care to remote-based and soon even AI-assisted care, access better skilling services, and so on. Remember, India has a population of over 1 billion people with large amounts of diversity. You know, you can go 100 miles away from where I am and you'll have different languages, different cultures, different food types. So it's extremely diverse. And so no one application, no one portal, either from the private sector or the government sector can be brought in to service these diverse needs. And therefore, it was imperative that we take a holistic view of this, build out the core public infra, and then allow multiple private innovators to build all sorts of solutions on top of it. And as we thought about what does it mean to invert usage of data, what does it mean to give people control of their data, 3 perspectives came up. One was a technology perspective, which is essentially this cannot happen unless there are a common set of interoperable technical standards put in place, unless consent itself is standardized. So if an individual or a small business expresses the need to port their data from one service provider to any other, that expression should be codified. Otherwise, you will not have different entities interpreting it the same way, and you will also not be able to represent it to the individual in an informed, consented manner. The second step that India did is we said we had to create a new class of institutions. We cannot have consent being captured either on the data provider's end or on the data consumer's end, both of which are fraught with perverse incentives. And so therefore, while ensuring that data remains with the provider, with the custodian, what India did was we unbundled the consent from the custodian, but we didn't give it to the data consumer, which is what, let's say, the UK went down in the path of open banking and in other countries, because that creates all sorts, that's rife with misaligned incentives. We saw that play out with Facebook Cambridge Analytica. So we unbundled consent from the custodian, but we didn't give it to the data consumer. And instead, we created a new class of institutions called consent managers that truly have a fiduciary responsibility to work with the end consumer and create informed consent experiences, collect that consent, and facilitate the subsequent flow of data, while data remains at source and shared only in the context of the transaction. And the third, of course, is that consent does not absolve the data consumers from accountability. And they must be responsible, and they have to be appropriate governance norms put in place and penalties in case those governance norms are not followed. And that's where the legal framework comes in. And India has drafted a data protection bill that's currently under discussion in our parliament and should soon, over the next year to two, be passed as well. While, of course, the regulated sectors continue to have existing privacy regulations in place, but this bill would extend it to other private, non-regulated categories of data as well. Now, I'll deep dive into the consent manager system and the way it works. And I'll also show you a quick demo that brings this to life so that it's not too abstract. So on the left-hand side, you have financial information providers And I'm bringing out an example from the financial sector. This is rolling out in the financial sector. It's rolling out in the health sector. It's rolling out for telecom data and other government data as we speak. But the example I'm talking to you out here is pertaining to financial. All follow the same architecture. So on the left-hand side, you have financial information providers. This could be any custodian, your bank, your mutual fund, your insurance, any taxation system, and so on. On the right-hand side, you have financial information users. These are entities that want access to your data to provide you any sort of service. It could be credit, it could be personal finance management, it could be wealth management, other sorts of predictions, recommendations, and decisions. And the question is, how does the user enable this flow? As we know, currently, financial data sharing is completely broken. The user either goes to each financial information provider physically, downloads his documents, and runs around to different portals, downloads multiple copies, creates a folder, and uploads that to a lender, or he physically runs around to different financial information providers. For example, you go to the bank branch and many other places, and then you take printouts of that information, and then take those printouts. And this creates huge problems, especially in a country like India, where physical barriers are, physical distances create enormous barriers in access to a range of these services in an inclusive manner. But that becomes a predominant way of sharing, besides for, of course, screen scraping, which is extremely primitive. The user going to a financial information user, giving out their username and password, and allowing that to be screen scraped. And I mean, in this day and age of technology, that should no longer be acceptable. And so therefore, what we did is we said the individual, there are two options. One is you could have the individual, going to either the financial information provider, each of them, and giving consent. But as we know, in most financial transactions, and this gets even more evident in health transactions where you share a longitudinal view, you'd have to run around to different providers. And the same on the financial information user side. So if you go and you have consent collected by the financial information user, in that case, financial information users have absolutely no incentive to create an informed consent experience, because they are interested in accessing the maximum amount of data that you need. And even if they do, you're going to interact with millions of financial information users, and so you're not going to even have a track record of where all you give consent. And so therefore, what we did in India is we unbundled the consent and placed it into the hands of a new class of institutions that you see in this center of your screen called consent managers. The entire framework is based on a set of national technical standards that have been published. So India has codified electronic consent, and it's based on a set of principles we called organs. So O is it's an open standard. R is the consent is revocable. So I could give consent to access my data every day for the next 1 month to, let's say, a wealth manager, but then I can go back and revoke it. G is the consent is very granular. So I could choose not to share my entire bank transaction statement, which is privacy revealing, but I could only choose to share a particular row and column, maybe a particular set of credit or debits, or I could even share a query on top of that, which is, let's say, if a lender just wanted to know, do I have a minimum average balance greater than 10,000 rupees, then I can just share the output of that query. I don't need to share my entire raw data. A in organs is auditable, so structured audit logs are generated every time consent is created, data is shared. N is notice, so just like when money leaves your account, you get notified. In the new paradigm, when data is shared about you, you get notified as well. And S is it's secure, so the end-to-end data flow is encrypted. Based on these principles, the consent managers essentially generate your electronic consent artifact. So users can register with a range of consent managers. For example, in the financial sector, these consent managers, there have been 7 that have been given an in-principle approval through the central bank, and 4 that have also been subsequently given an operational license. So the user has a choice in terms of which consent manager they go to. They can then discover where all their data resides, link those accounts, and you'll get a handle, for example, Siddharth at the rate of CM1. And then I can go to, let's say, a PFM app on the right-hand side and give them my consent handle. And the PFM app will then raise a consent request, which will show up on my consent manager. I can review it, approve it, and if I approve it, that consent artifact is sent to each of the custodians who will fetch the information and then encrypt it, digitally sign it so that downstream trust is maintained, and then share it in real time with the financial information user. So the guiding principles behind what I just outlined and that go beyond organs for the consent artifact is it's really about restoring control, giving users agency over their information. The second is the consent must be an informed experience, and informed is very contextual. What might be informed to me may not be informed to you. Some people may also require various forms of audio-visual assistance and other types of assistance to create an informed consent experience. And therefore, you need a market ecosystem of players that drive that. You need to ensure that there's accountability for the data consumers so that just because an individual has consented, that does not absolve them of all the responsibility. And that's where the legal framework falls in place. It should be accessible and affordable to individuals at scale. There should be incentive alignment. So what's interesting to note in India is that this entire development, while the technical standards have been notified through government agencies, the subsequent adoption of it have actually been market-driven. And that's very fascinating because it's not been mandated as of yet for banks and other service providers to adopt the system. And it's through market-aligned incentives of principle of reciprocity, incentives of this further expanding their own market, that the largest banks in India have come on board. This is very different from developments either in Australia, UK, and other parts of the world, where it's often mandated, hence gets viewed as a compliance-driven function, and people are extremely sluggish to then move forward. Of course, open standards are very critical so that you have interoperability within a sector, across sectors, and possibly across borders as well. The storage of data is decentralized. Consent managers are legally prohibited from storing the data, so data remains at source. It's only picked up and shared in the context of a transaction. The identity behind this is federated, and so the user can discover and link his accounts based on whichever ID the custodian, for example, your bank, is a provider of. So you do not need a unique ID to participate in the system. Because of purpose being a part of the consent artifact, you can now ensure that the transactions that you share, if I share it for the purpose of a loan, then other types of information like health data is not shared as a part of that, and your consent manager can notify you about the same. And it's not just about enabling data portability, because your consent manager, since it's a single view that you interact with and it has this fiduciary responsibility, this can be expanded to enabling other types of data rights. So the right, exercising your right to be forgotten, exercising the right to access and confirmation, whether a provider has processed your data and how have they processed it, and other data rights that the world over is talking about. And of course, the system should be evolvable. So over a period of time, you could imagine whether you plug in the work that's been happening by the MIT Solid Pods project or other forms of, on the data consumer side, more privacy-preserving ways of data sharing through multi-party computation, homomorphic encryption, secure storage on the client side. Those two can be easily integrated as part of the framework. What I'll now do is show you a quick
Siddharth, just giving you a 1 minute notification there.
Yeah. So I will send across, the slides are published, so I'll skip the demo then. It's a quick 1 minute demo, and you guys can take a look at it right after, whenever you have the time. But to summarize, this framework is now rolling out for government data, so individual certificates, mark sheets, identity documents, over 4 billion documents have been made available. It's also rolling out for regulated data in the financial space. And earlier this year, it was also launched for health information as well. Technical standards have been laid out. And so in the reference links in the presentation, you should take a look at them. And really, if there's any feedback, it's very similar to what the MyData community has been talking about, similar set of principles as I was going through the MyData white paper, absolutely a very similar set of principles, and would love to get your feedback. A lot of the rollout has been driven through technical standards and self-regulatory organizations in alignment with the overarching personal data protection bill that India has been working on. And this is now being adopted, and conversations have started with a range of countries across the world, including Australia, the UK, Norway, Netherlands, Africa. Very soon you should see, in fact, future state, along with the World Bank, publishing how DAPA would be implemented in the context of Africa as well. So both emerging and developed economies are now seriously looking at this framework as they operationalize the intent of their individuals, which is giving them control, giving them agency, allowing them to access better socioeconomic services. With that, thank you so much, and that's a wrap.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Siddharth, for that comprehensive overview of all of those different components that you're a part of. Certainly a complex and multi-layered job that you've got. I've got a question or two here, and others might have them. Again, directing you to Kiko Chat so we can keep track of those questions. My question is, what's been the most dramatic social impact of empowerment, engagement, and the new payment systems that you've proposed? And in terms of it being dramatic, was it surprising that it had such an impact?
Yeah, so if we look at it, I'll answer it in two ways. One is on the payment side, and second, we're a population of 1.3 billion individuals. Only 25 million Indians were actively transacting on credit cards, right? So that's almost a rounding error given the size of our population. When UPI was implemented, and 4 years down, we've got over 300, nearing 400 million Indians as a part of the UPI payment system, where they now have the ability to provide low-value, high-volume transactions. So they're truly empowered. As you know, given the diversity in India, it's often very difficult because of physical barriers, because of different languages. For individuals to interact with institutions, there's often a power asymmetry that sets in place. And because individuals are now in control of operating their own bank account through their own mobile phone in an experience based on whichever app they choose, there are multiple providers that allows them the choice and freedom to access a range of services. In the context of data, this is primarily unlike, I would say, when you think about it from a global perspective, a lot of developed markets view these frameworks more from increasing competition in the space. In India, it's about increasing inclusion. In the credit space, India is severely under-penetrated. So you've got 30 million Indians that have a thick file in a credit bureau, right? Again, almost a rounding error. And so what this framework allows Indians to do is share their information, progressively get access to shorter ticket credit, build up their trust, and over a period of time get access to larger ticket loans that they may use for a range of purposes. And so this is rolling out not just for individuals, but more so for small businesses. A lot of the lending that's happened in India so far has only been asset-driven and not cash flow based. And so because of this infrastructure, we're seeing a shift in the banking system from asset-based lending, which is against collateral like a land, factory, and so on, towards lending based on your cash flows. And for them to receive your cash flows, you need to give permission to share the data representation of it. So those are some of the areas. Of course, health applies as well for accessing remote care. But those are some of the areas that we've been seeing, both from the payment system side as well as from the consent system.
Excellent. And I'll just finish with one question and just give you a minute to answer it. What have been the social reactions to things? In particular, some of the componentry you talk about is centralized. They need to be policed and audited and secured. Health data is one of those things that obviously makes the headlines, especially when it goes missing. What's been the social reaction to the construction of these sorts of things in the new digital world?
Yeah, so again, it's a couple of nuances there, Jonathan. One is the data empowerment and protection architecture is completely decentralized. So data remains at source with your health provider, with your bank, with your mutual fund. Of course, as part of the India stack, there is the creation of Aadhaar, which is a centralized identity. It has to be centralized because it involves biometrics that have to be deduplicated that are subsequently used downstream for a range of services. But Aadhaar is actually not a mandatory part of the data empowerment and protection architecture. So in fact, if you look at the rollout in finance and in health, none of it involves the usage of the Aadhaar identity. So these are loosely coupled components, so to speak. In the context of data, I think it's still early days in terms of how users interact with it. We're seeing a lot of new user experiences be created. We are looking at it as a 3 to 5 year journey as the ecosystem matures, as the consent managers create higher quality informed consent experiences and consumers start adopting it. I think it's still early to say in terms of, broadly what have been the set of consumer reactions on the data side.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much again for all your time, for the work and effort that you have put into the presentation, but also the work that you do. I'm sure if you achieve the goals as set out, that you've detailed here as set out by your organisation and others like it, that it will lead to a dramatic impact on society, a lot more inclusion, especially at the financial level for people who might not normally have access to those sorts of services, and subsequently constructing it around a user-centric view that starts to decentralise that information and decouple it from centralised systems will lead to greater efficiencies as well. So thanks again, Siddharth, for your presentation. We now turn our attention to Kaliya Young, who in many ways doesn't need much of an introduction. I'd say one of the most highly profiled people in identity in the world for 16 years or more. She's been championing the cause of building the emergence of an identity layer for the internet and basing that on open standards. She co-founded the IIW in 2005 and continues to convene that on a regular basis. Her bio is there to see on the website, and I don't want to go into too much detail into it. I'm sure a number of you understand and know what sort of impact Kaliya has had over a long period of time. But 3 things stood out to me as I was looking through it. You can be famous for things, and that's fine, but probably better than being well known is making a great impact. And Kaliya's done that in lots of ways, but here are 3. She's a community builder. She firmly believes in building a community to achieve these things together. She's an institutional liaison, so she doesn't just keep it inside a small group of people. It expands out into government and other agencies and impact that can be felt at in a social sense on a national level. And she's also a privacy advocate, which is a major thing that we're all very well aware of, and that's baked into her attitude towards user-centric data privacy standards. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Kaliya, and you can take it from here.
Thanks, Jonathan. So the title of my talk is From Data Protection to Data Empowerment, Not an Easy Path for the Technology Pragmatist. And I'm going to start off by declaring that I am a technology pragmatist, meaning that I want to put myself in the middle of the spectrum between what I call the neo-Luddites on the one hand, who've never met a technology that they don't like and are throwing cold water on any innovation, mostly because they don't want to engage with the details. And on the other hand, the techno-utopianists who haven't met a technology or business model based on neoliberal economic premises that they didn't like. The future will be great, just trust us, they say. And they don't really welcome intensive inquiry into how these things work or the details of these systems, along with discernment about how power flows through these systems. And I argue as a technology pragmatist that we need to engage in both types of questions and deal with how things work and how power flows in these systems. And in this talk, I'm going to put forward several big questions that I think we need to consider. My starting point as a technology pragmatist is advocating for innovations in technical infrastructure and capabilities so that people can be in the center of their own digital representation and their data lives. And that path is a noble one, but it's not an easy one. So I've been in the technical weeds with folks working on this vision at the IIW, the Internet Identity Workshop, for 15 years. And we've really struggled to make it real. And I'm excited about the developments coming out of our community. I also was early to the MyData party. I founded the personal data ecosystem 10 years ago with this vision very similar to MyData, bringing together people and consumers with ethical businesses to make this vision real. I also believe that you can't solve the problems with word alone. and with laws. I think GDPR was put in place, but its authors seem to lack knowledge and understanding of what was practically possible in technology systems. And it's also true that now 4 years into GDPR, there has been very limited enforcement. And so what does it mean to have those laws if they're not really being enforced? And if you look at, for example, the GitHub repository of the data transfer project, it's basically seen no activity for a year. It's almost like it's been abandoned. So what good are these laws without enforcement? So as a technical pragmatist, I have a few more questions, and some of these are based on what I learned while I was in India studying the UIDAI, the system that issues Aadhaar numbers, when I was there 2 years ago. So the question number one is, can big tech regulate itself? And as was mentioned by the earlier presenter, there are many self-regulating entities in India. And for the system that was articulated with account aggregators, there's a new one forming called Samadhi that proposes to be this self-regulating entity to hold the industry to account, but it's all by industry members themselves. What I learned about the UIDAI is it's also self-regulating. So there is no outside entity that it is responsible and accountable to, and it is its own complaints manager. So it's really difficult to get these systems to really work if they are unresponsive to critics and if they're self-regulating. So big question number two is, can new technology emerge and be held accountable? And what happens if critics of new technology are trolled? So this is what happened in India when critics of UIDAI were harshly and extensively trolled on Twitter, and it came to light that one of the main trollers was in fact a co-founder of iSprit. And then to go even further, what happens when critics of new technology have police reports filed against them? Over 30 people and leaders of NGO organizations critical of UIDAI and Aadhaar had police reports filed against them in their local precinct. Some of these NGOs had it made abundantly clear that if they continue to research and publicly raise issues with UIDAI and related to emerging technologies around the India stack, they would have their NGO status threatened and their ability to do any work severely limited. So this raises real questions about the ability of civil society to meaningfully engage in raising questions and seeking accountability of these new systems when there's this much suppression. Big question number three, can an ecosystem emerge when there is only one of a thing? So right now in the system that's been built in India, there's a DigiLocker provider, and there is only one of them. It's a locker service in the cloud where you store your government issued ID. There's not a lot of choice and it's run by one entity. So there's also technical challenges with this type of architecture as well. When I was speaking to government officials who were working on this, they were overwhelmed trying to manage all the requests from educational institutions trying to make direct hard connections into the system to upload student achievements and also download records from prospective students. It was clear that expanding this to even more sectors might not be doable because it would mean that every single institution in the country would all have to federate directly into this bottleneck. So is any model sustainable if every institution must connect to one thing? I think this also makes a strong argument for some of the more decentralized architectures. And can an ecosystem emerge when there is only one identity provider that matters, that you must authenticate to, that is phone home when accessing services? And there are diagrams like this one that put the Aadhaar number in the center of the whole stack. I will say that the UPI is a very remarkable system. It totally disrupted the credit card payment rails and effectively made ultra low cost payments clearing system that the whole economy can leverage. It's also true that UPI sees everything, so it could potentially give the government total transparency into the economy and what's happening. But it also works at scale. And looking at the movement of financial data into account aggregators, and it's very likely they will get this working, some of these earlier questions that I raised come back around, which is, what about the critics? What about a lack of recourse when things go wrong? And what about the lack of self-regulation and the issues that arise with a lack of external accountability? So for big question number 4, I'm going in a little bit of a different direction. Can we ask an industry to innovate modalities of getting feedback and discernment? So MyData right now as an organization elects its board, but could we go beyond voting a board of directors, and could we leverage things like innovation games, deliberative and dialogue processes, like those being collected by the National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation? Can we leverage resources like Participedia, and could we have more citizens' juries? Could we imagine randomly selecting users and running citizens' juries and innovations games on a regular basis to engage the customers of a company or users of larger ecosystems to better create systems of meaningful feedback and accountability from the people we claim to be working for, those end users? I find inspiration for MyData and this movement overall in the Social Venture Network. This is a community I learned about over 20 years ago, and it was founded by entrepreneurs like Ben and Jerry's, the ice cream guys, who built a community amongst ethical and sustainable businesses. It's why I started the personal data ecosystem. But one of the things coming out of those movements is that governance is hard, and we need to think about it. So big question number 5 is, how do we meaningfully govern these new ecosystems in ways that don't super overburden them, but also don't just let things continue on their current trajectory? Because it seems like GDPR is favoring the big guys. The trouble with tech is that intention is not enough. We had don't be evil. How's that working? Not so great. Or making the world more open and connected. One thing I know about new technology as a technology pragmatist is that the details matter. They matter a lot. And the details are where the struggle for real user empowerment and control lie. And the current power flows can be shifted to new ones that better align with people and humanity. How do we get enough care and interest in the details? It's a big question. Can people and organizations we trust really see the details and see how things really work for us? MyData is in tech, but not necessarily in the weeds of how it will work, and we need to get to them. And not just keep pushing it down the road. Standards are a huge part of the details that matter, and not just open APIs. If we'd seen investment in user-centric digital identity standards in 2003 to 2005, when first proposed by PlanetWork in the Augmented Social Network paper that was shipped to the Ford Foundation and Open Society Institutes, we might not be facing these dilemmas now. But they didn't get it when those innovators presented these futuristic ideas. True technical interop means parts of the ecosystem are replaceable and that there isn't lock-in for one stack or provider. To this end, I co-lead the work on the confidential data store specification in the Secure Data Store Working Group at the Decentralized Identity Foundation. I'm also active in tracking developments in the self-sovereign identity and decentralized identity communities. And in the last few weeks, I potentially got divergent paths to talk pre-divergence, which is critical in the standards world, discussing verifiable credentials and object capabilities on the CCG list. I also co-chair the DIF interoperability working group and push for convergence so that these amazing things we're working on actually work together. Question number 6, can we make self-sovereign identity tech actually bring public key encryption that is usable to normal people? And I will say that we can make data private and usable, and I'm feeling like the answer is an optimistic maybe that all of this will work. Big question number 7. This is the last big question. Are we looking far enough into the future? I also know that from talking to folks like Liam Broza that waves and waves of personal data are about to get exponentially larger with AR and VR headset data. We must have robust user-centric containers for all of this data, and I'm not sure that we're ready. We must look ahead to where the metaphorical ball is going in this technology game with massive amounts of data and AI. And the question is, can all of that personal data that is generated work for us? And will this data and the analysis of it make us happier and better aligned with nature and the planet? This is a key aspect of the originating motivation for Planet Work to convene and ask itself what the missing piece of infrastructure was that is needed to truly make information communication technology work for people and the planet. Can we do more with less, or are we just being motivated by the owner's profit to make us consumers driven by Ayn Rand libertarianism? So why do we believe that people and groups should have access to their data? Can we, in the next wave of technology development, center those who were marginalized in the last wave? Can we listen to those who know what has gone wrong with tech so far because it's happened to them already? I've asked a lot of big questions in this talk. Can big tech, government, or private sector regulate itself? Can new technology emerge and be held accountable? Can we get out of solutions of decentralized dependencies? Can we innovate new modalities of feedback to systems and systems regulators? How do we really and meaningfully govern these new ecosystems? Can SSI make public key encryption usable by normal people? And are we looking far enough into the future? I will leave you with this one important question. Why do we think that people should be empowered to control their digital representations of themselves and their data? When we know why, we will have more understanding of what aspects of how the technical details that are important. We must innovate new ways and let new businesses and opportunities bloom. I believe that open standards, protocols done right, ones that have maximal expressive capacity will be key. By expressive capacity, they create a set of rules that make them understandable, but also within them give enormous freedom to express. And I believe that decentralized identifier and verifiable credentials, also known as SSI, provide a good starting point for us to build what we need to fundamentally disrupt the current technology ecosystems from monocultures to an agroecology of technology. This is my vision as a technology pragmatist. I know many of you care about these questions in various ways, and many of the sessions will engage them. I'm looking forward to spending these next 3 days in our time together exploring them with all of you. Thanks.
Absolutely amazing. Thank you so much for those, excuse me, incredibly thought-provoking questions. And only 7. I feel like you could have come up with another 13 and blown all of our minds. But thank you for that. And I think what I was just reflecting on was I like the way you framed some of your responses and some of the reactions that you had into what Siddharth had said and what you'd observed yourself about DEPA and ADA and other systems, it reminds me of how MyData works and why it works well. We can have diverse opinions about certain things, and what those diverse opinions allow us to do is to become stronger together. I've got a few questions. There were some raised in the chat, not too many raised in Kiko chat, I think, because everyone was kind of having their minds blown. But I'll ask my questions and perhaps some more will pop up there. You had an optimistic maybe in there. I think that was a great phrase. Can we get there? I have an optimistic maybe. So if civil society can't regulate, and I think time has shown us that's not the case, if the government lacks the capability to build the right infrastructure, and if the individual may have lack of technical talent to make it happen, in your view, what gives you hope for the next generation of systems or mechanisms that are evolving or have occurred that we are building or are being built or proposed so that we can maintain data privacy and maintain a sense of user centricity? What gives you hope for that optimistic maybe to come true?
Yeah, I mean, I think the optimistic maybe comes from the people within the community who are both around the Internet Identity Workshop, but also the MyData community as a very complementary one, in that they are personally mission driven to find a way to get these technical building blocks that we need to get out of the conundrum that we're in with the current kind of technical dominance of the big nine. And I'm optimistic that we can build tools and services using these open standards that create a new sort of entrepreneurial floor for a whole bunch of a forest of new tools and services to emerge that's highly competitive. So when we saw the web standards for HTML emerge on top of the internet infrastructure, that was like an amazing Cambrian explosion of businesses and tools and services. And I think we're on the cusp potentially of seeing that again. If we can run fast enough and get enough interoperability soon enough that can happen.
Excellent. Well, thanks for those points. I have another question. What do you see or have you seen, and I know you've been directly involved in some of these things over time, but what do you see now or you foresee, so now or into the future, where some of the most dramatic data abuses will occur?
Oh, I don't know.
No pressure to answer that accurately.
I feel that... Well, I know that the folks who like I mentioned in my talk, the folks who've been talking about AR and VR and the implications of that the executives who are driving AR and VR forward know that they sort of have like potentially like tons of, for lack of better terms, toxic data on their hands. Like they don't want to hold all that user data because then they're responsible for it. But we have cute little data store things, but quite frankly, Digimi's architecture, which you get to host your own data on Dropbox, isn't going to hold all my VR data in real time, right? Like and I don't know any entrepreneur right now who has those tools and services for me and my headset data, which apparently I didn't believe cell phones would happen, right? Of course, I've had a cell phone for 10 years and that was 20 years ago. I thought that. So I don't believe everybody's going to wear glasses on their head, but what do I know? So I think it would be great to do some community futures work to explore this together, because like, I don't know what the future looks like, but I think we together could discern several different futures and figure out which one we want to go to together.
Excellent. So I had a question here, which was asked originally to Siddharth, but I think applies uniformly, and I'd like your feedback on it. It says, will consumers or people care enough to take control of their data, and what would drive them to do that?
Okay, consumers don't care in one way, and we need to build tools that just make it happen, right? So I think we also need to really think about, and this is partly what I think India has right. And, you know, is this building infrastructure that helps people move data so they can do things in their lives. They're not doing it for its own sake. They're doing it because they want to do the next thing in their life. And I think this is my hope about why one of the reasons I have an optimistic yes around the self-sovereign identity technologies, because I think the entrepreneurs and the applications that I've seen imagined and starting to be built help people do things they want to do. Oh, and bonus, you get to like have more control of your data. So I think it's more about just how does it become how things work, as opposed to an afterthought where we're saying you could export it somewhere like we've done with GDPR and other regulatory frameworks that say you have the right to export. No, the infrastructure needs to just work centering people by default. And potentially, the other thing is people don't want to do all that work. Well, I don't do all the work of storing my money in that counter back there. I go to the bank and I put it there and they do all the hard stuff. And I think I hope we will see the emergence, and this is what many of the MyData operators is data banks for people to put their data in a fiduciary way with someone else who knows how to help them manage it. And we don't expect them to do it all themselves on their own home server. So that's another reason for an optimistic maybe.
Excellent. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring Siddharth back into the conversation, and for the next 12 or so minutes, maybe 12 and a half if we're lucky, we'll have a conversation between the three of us so we can air some of those things that we've covered off. There's a bunch of questions happening in Kiko chat and being upvoted. You just press the little thumbs up icon and it'll be popped to the top of the list, and I want to get through those as well. I might start off with one to you, Siddharth, but Kaliya, you can comment. Why are individuals not allowed to operate their own consent managers?
Yeah, so if you look at it from an open, so there are two aspects to it. One is the data store aspect, and second is the consent manager, which is the permissions layer on top of it. The architecture abstracts away from the data store. So individuals may allow for their data to be stored with each of the custodians, or they may allow for it to be stored in a pod or any other personal data store, and that may be hosted on their own individual device. In the current system, the consent managers itself get certified. So an individual, and they're being certified to ensure that they meet a bare minimum of the informed consent requirements, because we cannot open it up completely. Otherwise, you're going to have misinformed consent being collected and given. And to address the nuance, the rollout is not driven purely with self-regulatory organizations. On the back of that, the central bank is instrumental in putting in place the licensing framework. So I think while it's a very valid point in terms of keeping it completely open and allowing individuals to create their own, or individual developers to create their own consent managers, in our view, currently, as the ecosystem stands, it's important that there is a system of certification in place to ensure that individuals do not go ahead and give ill-informed, misinformed consent, or any of the other security and basic privacy implications that exist. So just for those enforcement of those bare minimum standards, there is a certification framework, and it's not completely open.
So I'll throw to Kaliya to you for comment on that.
No, I'm good. Let's go on to the next question.
No worries. There's another question here, Siddharth. Again, is there a market of competing consent managers? You've just touched on some of these. Can one change their consent manager?
Absolutely. So there is a competitive market of consent managers. Like I brought out, as things stand, there is probably around 8 consent managers that exist across both the financial and health domain, and we expect many more. And this is by design. For example, I may choose a consent manager that is a completely self-service mobile application. But other individuals may choose a consent manager that is assisted. So there is an operator, a human operator, that assists you in that experience in ensuring that you go ahead and give an informed consent, go ahead or not, or you deny it. And for a large part of India, a lot of their experiences with the internet happens in an assisted manner. You would have consent managers aimed not just at individuals, but at small businesses or enterprises. And we all know those authorization workflows are completely different. So as a result, it's important that there's an ecosystem of consent managers. A user can choose to register with any one. And if they so decide they don't prefer those services, they can go to the next. And that's where the open standards are critical, because consent managers do not have bilateral relationships with the data providers. Otherwise, that creates a lock-in. So let's say my bank partnered with one consent manager and I had two bank accounts, then I'll have to create two consent manager accounts, or I cannot port from one to the other. And so therefore, a fundamental part of the design is that every consent manager is interoperable with every single information provider. And that allows for a healthy competitive marketplace of consent managers to exist and users to choose whichever works best for them, try it out, close it, go to the next.
Excellent. Kaliya, you made a comment earlier about digital lockers. What would be an alternative way of handling that, or what could be a more ideal way for that to be handled, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I would point folks to my friends in the group Karana. They are the community of security researchers that I met while I was in India, and who've done a lot of research about how the UADAI operates along with the India stack. And it's a good question. And I think we're seeing with the emergence of the SSI technologies, which, just to be fair, when India was beginning planning these systems about 12 years ago, they were making choices based on what was available then. And SSI and these emerging technologies that are more decentralized are only 5 years old. So I think there's a question about how, is there a future trajectory where Indians have a choice of who their cloud agent provider is to store all sorts of documents and data. And my hope is that as India continues to develop, that there will be more choice in these ecosystems, and we'll see.
Excellent. I think the proof is in the pudding, as they say, and that will become more evident over time. A question here from Kiko Chat is, how and when will the poor benefit from this project? And perhaps in a wider sense, if we think about this in Kaliya, you can add in your input here. When it comes to people who are less technically able or don't have access to certain technical services, or certain people in certain groups who can't be included because perhaps of a temporary or permanent disability, how do we include those sorts of people? So I'll throw to you specifically in regards to India. How will the poor benefit from that project? So Siddharth, to you first.
Sure. Okay. So there are a couple of aspects, like I mentioned. One is, if you look at it from a data sharing perspective, today there are enormous physical barriers for the poor to access any financial, health, or other socioeconomic services, government delivery that may be beneficial for them. But a lot of them do have access to either a smartphone. Over 400 million Indians have a smartphone. Over 800 million have a feature phone. So they have these methods of communication available with them in their control. Now, on the back of that, they can use it to facilitate sharing of their data with their own agency. So these systems are not linked in the back end. It's with their consent that it then gets shared either for a government benefit or for health insurance or for getting access to progressively increasing amounts of credit and so on that they may use to benefit their lives socioeconomically. The same exists on the payment world as well. UPI is multimodal. So while it works on a smartphone modality, it also works on USSD, which is a feature phone modality. It also works using your biometrics, which is on the back of the Aadhaar system. And they may then use this to deduct their bank account and transfer electronically in real time, instantaneously money to any other service provider. All of these platforms are agnostic of the use case that's being built on top of it. So it can be used across sectors, not just limited to financial services. The second point that I'd like to bring out just on your previous question, Jonathan, is there are two aspects on the DigiLocker project. One is the DigiLocker framework does allow for, and that's the reason why you see those same design principles cascade. Even in UPI, India has multiple payment app providers while owning the public infrastructure. So you have WhatsApp Pay, you have PhonePe, Paytm, various big tech players, small tech startups on the same public infrastructure that's controlled by the NPCI. And the same design principle extends even in the world of consent managers. So the DigiLocker framework does allow for the provisioning of multiple DigiLocker providers, and happy to send out documents in that regard. In fact, the government even set up a DigiLocker authority. Now, they haven't yet operationalized it, so Kaliya does bring up an important point. But by design, the framework does support, and the technical standards do support multiple DigiLocker providers to come into existence.
Kaliya, did you want to comment on that? Or in particular, I know you've been a champion for inclusion for some period of time. Anything in regards to...
I think there is a saying that actually came both from the disability rights community, but also from the folks who were pushing for research around AIDS, which is not about us without us, right? So I'm very concerned, and this applies across the board everywhere. I'm very concerned that the populations and the communities who we're claiming to serve are not involved. And this happened just this week. I went to a meeting within one of the SSI groups talking about human trafficking and trying to solve it. And I was like, where are the women's groups that work with those populations? They need to be in this room if we're going to address those problems. So this is true also in the context of India. I met amazing people working on digital literacy in rural areas. I linked to one of them, the Digital Empowerment Foundation. And I think more work needs to be done by all of us technologists to get out into the field and to really engage with the populations that we think we will serve in the end, and do it sooner rather than later.
Excellent. That's a very good comment. Well, I'd like to wrap up this session by thanking our two presenters. They've done a fantastic job with the content they've produced. Siddharth, very impressed with the comprehensive nature of the topics on hand and the ones you've answered. So thank you so much for your detail. And Kaliya, thanks for your clear insights. And those tough questions, crikey, I really hope people go away and spend a bit of time looking through those big questions. If we could all answer them, I'm sure the world would be a significantly better place. But we've been hearing here about India, and the focus has been on India. But then I throw the question to you, in terms of your context, where you are around the world, be it with a small amount of influence or apparently, or with a large amount of influence, how would you make a difference, knowing some of the topics that we've covered here and the themes that we've covered off? How could you potentially contextualise some of those things that you've heard? I'd love to hear from you. You can put it into the Kiko chat window there, or you can make comments about the session, or if you write notes up about the session, please make sure that you do send them around. And finally, finishing off, I'd like to thank again the MyData team for the opportunity for all of us to get together, and wish you all the best for the rest of the conference. Take care, and we'll catch up soon.
Thank you.